Hi there, it's Mark and welcome to the very first episode of Photoshop for Photographers. In this course I'll be teaching you all the basics and intermediate steps in editing your pictures, really focusing down on what photographers need to do with their pictures. That's not suggesting you're a bad photographer, by the way, but let's dig out of that hole. The more common tasks and some intermediate tasks that photographers would like to be able to do for the photos should the need arise. Got out of that one. Okay, so to make the most of this series, it's download, play along, press pause, ask questions. So this is the rough order we're going to be doing things in, but to really download the material, each and every lesson will have the images used down below, linked in the notes to the video. Go and get them. Press pause on your way through. Every video will have parts to it, so rather than watch the whole thing in its entirety, just press that pause button. Shut me up. That would be make a change. And then ask questions. So every question posted in comments I will answer if it's relating to this material. If there are any common themes, then possibly I'll slot in a specific video, a bespoke video to do that. At worst, we can have a Q&A roundup at the end. I'll try not to record these back to back. I will leave a little bit of time initially so that I'm only just about 2 episodes ahead of you watching them, and therefore I can probably feed some of the answers to questions in as we go along. That's how it works. But really, download, press pause, ask questions. Ask questions about what? Right, well, this is what we're going to be doing. This is a rough running order. So first things first, we'll learn about Photoshop and its relationship to Lightroom, its sister product, loading and saving documents, the basics of photo editing and adjustment tools. Then we'll go and look at layers, masks and blend modes. These are layers down here, and it is really important that you understand how they work. Some of the feedback I've had from fellow photographers is that layers can be confusing. They don't need to be. I promise not to make them confusing. I hopefully will make them intuitive for you and easy to understand. Then we get into a long list of photographer tools and techniques and tasks, which is why this particular series is Photoshop for Photographers. So we'll be looking at tidying up your pictures, removing unwanted artifacts, spots, straightening and cropping your pictures. Then we've got retouching, dodging and burning, adding textures, and frequency separation. Hurrah! Frequency separation. I would slap the person who came up with that expression across the head with the biggest Photoshop book I can find, because it's phrases like that, I think, that make Photoshop seem a bit more of a dark art, that you have to cast dried chicken bones across the table at midnight under a full moon in order to get your pictures to turn out correctly. Nothing could be farther from the truth. It's just a stupid phrase for something that's actually really quite useful. I'll show you how to use it. Once you understand how to use it, you probably will use it. Then we'll be looking at tone curves, adding gradients, color grading, color changing, color matching, and various photo filters. So all of these are geared around photography. And then there's more. We then move on to doing selections. Now we will have done more on layers on the way through. We'll have probably already touched on selections on the way through, but I'll do a roundup of the various selection tools, so there is at least a selections video to one side, what tool works best in what scenario and that sort of thing. And then we'll look at blend if. Blend if is probably a little bit more difficult to explain than it is to use, but like most of these tools, and we've got sliders, we're going to wriggle the sliders. We're going to look at what it does on screen. It doesn't matter what it's called. I will give the technical explanation, but we're going to see what happens on screen. Blend if, we will take a landscape picture from the Lake District, we'll take a fighter jet or a other plane, and we'll put it in the sky. They'll be on separate layers. We'll wriggle some sliders, and you will not be able to tell that the plane was not there in the first place. That's the power of blend if, and it'll only take us 15 seconds, by the way, and you can time that when we get to it. Then we'll bring it all together and start to look a little bit beyond the normal photography use of Photoshop and start bringing composites. So if you're up for taking this picture of Newcastle Quayside and putting a floating crystal ball above the water, we'll do that, or similar. We'll also bring together other components from other pictures and put them in, match their luminosity, match their colour, match their shadow, match their lighting, match their perspective, match their size, and we'll end up with a composite from other pictures. So that's what it's all about. It can be fun, it can be easy, and all the material's there. So download it, press pause, ask questions. I'm off for a brew. I'm going to play the titles, and when I come back, I'm going to start recording the very first of these. So hopefully you'll like them, hopefully you'll get engaged, and I'll see you very shortly. Let's get cracking. So in the notes below the video, you will find 2 URLs to download the material used today. If you haven't already done so and you want to actually play along, I suggest you press pause to shut me up and go and do that, and then I'll meet you when you press play again. Okay, I'm assuming you're back. These are the 2 URLs, and if you click on them, you will have 2 downloads. Let's go ahead and open these. There's one, and there's the other. Now, for this series, I'm assuming you are working in something like Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom, because most often Adobe Photoshop users have the monthly package, which includes Lightroom. So I'm going to be launching all our documents into Photoshop from Lightroom. However, in the next couple of minutes, I will show you how we do it from disk, just in case you haven't got Lightroom. And I can't really go through every single other form of photo editing tool from which we can start the journey. So I'm doing it from Lightroom, but I'm showing you now how you can do it from disk. So if all else fails, we have both got a common understanding of how to get the documents into Photoshop. That said, here's our intro photos. Let's just click on these 2, and I'm just going to drag and drop them into my Lightroom. That's the easiest way I find to get them in, and I will import the documents. Now my import settings are set to do nothing other than add my copyright information, and we may cover that in a future episode. So these are just coming straight in unprocessed, and there they are. They look the same, but if I just double click on one, you can see this file is a JPEG up here, and if I go to the next one with my right arrow key, you can see this one is a RAW file. It looks a bit darker. RAW files generally do look darker because they are unprocessed, whereas a JPEG is already usually pre-processed in your camera to add a bit more spark, a bit more life, or whatever settings you've got your camera set to do. So how to get these into Photoshop, which is where we're going to be learning all about the tools, tricks, tips and techniques. Well, simply right click, edit in Adobe Photoshop. Now you have options here. I'm going to choose edit original, but if you'd already worked on this, if you'd already done some editing and you wanted to preserve that editing and take it into Photoshop to continue the journey, you'd probably want to edit a copy with the Lightroom adjustments already applied. For now, I'm just going to edit original. Let's click edit. The picture loads up into Photoshop, and we can do whatever we want with it. I'm just going to do Control or Command J, so Control J on a PC, Command J on a Mac to make a copy of it. So for all intents and purposes, Photoshop thinks I've made a change, which I have. So if I go now to close and save this, incidentally, that's just my signature brush up there. I'll just put something that looks a bit more like a normal brush and less distracting than my signature. So for all intents and purposes, Photoshop will want to save this. I can either click the X in the corner, which I generally do, or I could go File, Save, File, Close. I'm lazy. I just click the X and let Photoshop decide it's going to do it for me. So here it's going to close and save the JPEG, but there's a problem. Or rather, not a problem, there's a prompt. This is no longer just a simple JPEG. A JPEG is just, think of it as one flat image of your photograph. Here we've now got multiple layers. We'll be discussing layers in a bit, but it's more complex. There are separate layers which could have, and often do have, different things on them. So Photoshop says, look, I can't save this as a JPEG in this format. I need to save it as a PSD, a Photoshop document. Now there are options on here to change to alternate file types, but for simplicity's sake, for now, I'm staying with PSD. And where to put it? Well, it's going to put it back in my downloads. I think I'll put it on my desktop instead, and I'll click save, and it'll save and close the document. Meanwhile, back in Lightroom, we've still got the document there. If I press G for my gallery view, we've still got those 2 documents. There's no sign of the PSD. That's because it is on my desktop we saved it as a separate file. So let's go to the desktop and retrieve it, shall we? Mark, desktop. There it is. And I can drag and drop that back into Lightroom. And there on in, I'm fine. It's in Lightroom as a PSD. If I take it to Photoshop, it's a PSD. If I take it back to Lightroom, it's a PSD. It's not going anywhere. So let's do the same now with this picture, which was the raw version. The raw version. Incidentally, this is an electronics project I'm working on. This is a temperature sensor and a humidity sensor, and I'm just working out how to make them talk to each other, then output it to a screen. It's what I do on the evening when the family's in bed and there's nothing much on telly and I've got no photography to do, and yeah, it just helps me get through the day, or rather get through the night. Right click, edit in Adobe Photoshop, exactly as we did before. And there's our document in Adobe Photoshop. So let's do what we did before. Let's do Control or Command J to make a copy of it. B for a brush tool. I see that white is my foreground color, so I'm just going to put a white spot on just to make a difference. And I'm going to click X to save and close. Save. And this time it disappears from my screen, but if I go back into Lightroom, G for a gallery view, we've now got a third document. And if we look at that document, it's now got the word edit in its name. So with the raw files, we went straight into Photoshop. We saved as a TIFF file in this instance, and it took it back into Lightroom for us. So it's easy in that regard, but we will be working with JPEGs. So we have to get used to the fact that when you take a JPEG in and you change it, and there's more than one layer on there, Photoshop will want to change it on saving to a Photoshop document. Okay, let's just close Lightroom for the moment and do the same thing from File. So here are our files. So we were in our Downloads, we're in our Intros folder, and we had the JPEG. Let's just drag the JPEG straight into Photoshop. It's gone in. Let's do a change to it. B for our brush tool, put a few dots on it, and let's Control J, take a copy of it. So I've changed the file. I go to save, and we have the same thing again. It wants to save it as a PSD. So I'll just add the number 2 on the end, just in case I'm looking through these later and I want to differentiate between them. And I'll click save. And of course it isn't in Lightroom because we didn't even take it into Lightroom. Let's see what happens when we do a raw file. Incidentally, these are that's the PSDs just appeared there that we've just saved. Let's take the raw file straight into Lightroom. Sorry, straight into Lightroom, straight into Photoshop. And the reason why I probably said Lightroom there is because this doesn't look like Photoshop. This has just popped up. What's all this about? Well, this is Camera Raw, Adobe Camera Raw. You can't take a raw file straight into Photoshop. You have to go via a version of Camera Raw. Now that version of Camera Raw can either be this version that automatically pops up, or indeed Lightroom. If you take a look down here, you've got exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, texture, clarity, dehaze, and so on. If I just go back to Lightroom for a second, and on this picture, click D for my develop module, and come to basics, lo and behold, exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, texture, dehaze, and so on. They are all the same. So this is a Lightroom module, for want of a better description, within Photoshop. And you need to go via a form of Camera Raw to get into Photoshop if you're using a raw file. We didn't, we went straight from disk, so Photoshop says, no, hang on. You need to go via Adobe Camera Raw. Is it complicated? No, because in its very simplest form, you just click open down in the bottom right hand corner here. And we're back to where we started. Let's do Command J a couple of times, B for a brush tool, and let's put a little dot on each of those knobs. And then let's click X to save and close. And again, it's a raw file. In this format, it has to be a Photoshop document. So I'm just going to change that number 3 and save. Let's go back to our file system, and you can see that the number 3 files come in. Okay, so very quick recap. You can take all the images I provide to you into Lightroom or whatever editing software you've got, which allows you then to go into Photoshop. And from there, we can work on them. If it's a JPEG and we're doing lots of work with it, it will not save back as a JPEG, it will save back as a Photoshop document. Alternatively, you can do the same thing from disk directly into Photoshop. Same rules apply. If it's a JPEG and you've done extra layers on it, it will have to save it as a Photoshop document. If it's a RAW file, on its way into Photoshop, you will get Adobe Camera Raw pop up. Now, this isn't the first time we'll see Adobe Camera Raw. We'll actually be using it as a tool in Photoshop throughout the series. So that's it. Let's move on now and get to the interesting stuff and have a look at layers. So here are the two documents we're going to be using today to look at layers, adjustments and masks. The one on the left is a RAW file and the one on the right is a Photoshop document which I've preloaded with some layers for us just to get the initial grasp of what layers are about. When it comes to editing our actual picture, so I'll double click on this one, I'd be quite happy to edit this normally in Lightroom. So D for my developing tool, and I could adjust the exposure or whatever, all the usual things, and I'd quite happily edit this right here, right now. Indeed, 90% of my images, my photographs, are edited totally in Lightroom. The rest, which is part of my design work and part of my digital art, are generally almost exclusively I am in Photoshop. And then there's the little gap in between where some of my photographic work needs a little bit of an input from Photoshop, because Photoshop has got more tools and capabilities than Lightroom. But by and large, Lightroom's first class for editing pictures. But I'm going to resist that temptation today, and we're going to edit this in Photoshop so that we're on familiar ground. The sort of things we do in Photoshop will be exposure, for example. So we know where we are. I don't have to tell you about exposure, but we'll just see how it's done in Photoshop, how that adds a new layer, how we can control that new layer. G for our gallery view. Let's crack on with this particular document. Right click, edit in Adobe Photoshop, edit original. Now the first thing I'm actually going to do here is to right click underneath our layers. This is our layer stack, and make these large thumbnails so you get a better idea of what's in what layer as we're working through, whether or not they are switched on. This is switching them all on, and the clicking on the eye switches layers off. Okay, so how you see a picture in Photoshop is from the very top layer down through to the bottom. So if I switch on my horizontal stripes, you can see the two blue stripes across, and they are on top of, they are superimposed on top of the lighthouse because we're coming down through and we hit these first. If I do the same for the vertical stripes, we've got the yellow stripes, we come down through the stack, we hit the yellow stripes which are on top of the blue stripes which is on top of the lighthouse. I'm just going to hold the horizontal stripe with a click, drag and locate it, and I've swapped them around. So we're now coming down through the stack, our eye hits the blue stripes before the yellow, before the lighthouse. And similarly with the rest of the shapes. You see things from the top all the way down. So the very first layer we see is the triangle layer, which in turn is covering up some of the green, which in turn is covering up some of the red, and then the blue and the yellow and so on. But we could equally have just put that there. So that's the concept of layers. Even though this doesn't make good sense photographically, you read layers from the top down. You pass through each layer. If the layer switched off, you will not see it. If the layer has been made more transparent, and let me introduce you to the opacity slide. So this is the opacity slide. If we click to the right of the, you can type a percentage in, but if you click to the little down arrow you get a slider, and if I move this you can see our triangle is getting more transparent. And there are many times where you apply an effect in Photoshop which is too strong, and you might want to just use the opacity to tone it down a little bit. Okay, We don't need those shapes anymore. We're just now going to quickly introduce masks. I'm going to put a mask on this horizontal strip by clicking this icon here, which adds a mask. The default mask that something gets in Photoshop is a white mask. A white mask does nothing at all to the layer. A white mask allows everything to be seen. So our eye comes down through the stack, hits the first layer that is on, sees there's a mask, checks the mask to see what it needs to show you, and then carries on. In this case, the mask is pure white, so it will show you everything that's in this layer. If the mask was black, well, let's do that, shall we? While I'm on the mask, Control I on a PC, Command I on a Mac, that mask is now black. So it hides everything. That's the binary side of masks. Black hides everything in the layer. White shows everything in the layer. We will have masks through the course of this series where we've got some greys in there, so we're starting to make things more or less opaque via a mask, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, we're saying binary black and white. So our eye comes down through the stack, because you read it from the top to the bottom, hits the blue layer, it is switched on, and it checks the mask. The mask says, I'm sorry, I'm all black. I'm not going to let any part, not a single pixel in this layer is going to be seen. And so it says fair enough, and then onto yellow, and then onto St Mary's Lighthouse. Let's paint on this with white. So B for a brush tool, and come into our brush tool, make sure we've got a hard round brush. We'll bring it down to about 160, 150, something like that. Click to one side. D for to get default colors. Default colors in Photoshop are black and white, and they're over here. You can see the foreground color is white, the background color is black. If you press the letter X, it toggles between them. We will leave this so that white is the foreground. I've just said a white mask allows things to be seen, so let us click on a black mask and paint on the mask. I'm not painting on the layer, you can see that because I've got white on my brush. You can clearly see two blue lines, but I have painted white on the mask. So layers come down through from the top, hits the blue layer, says oh there's a mask, checks the mask. The mask says well I'll let you see what's in white, so it allows us to see this first stripe but not the second. White reveals and black hides. Alright, Control Z or Command Z on a Mac to undo that till I get back to a white mask. Not that you'd be doing this much in Photoshop, but let us now press X to get our brush to be black, and let's just paint on our mask here. And we are actually making this now look a little bit cross-hatched. So there's an example where we've used a mask, and you can see the two elements. So the eye comes down through the layer stack, hits this one, says yes I'm allowed to look at this one in the image, sees there's a mask, checks what's white, checks what's black, allows those components through that are in white, passes on to the next layer, passes on to the next layer, and that's it. Layers are read from top to bottom. Your eye looks down through them and they are governed by whether or not they are switched on. They are governed by whether or not there's a mask on them, and they are governed by the overall opacity of the layer. There are other things we will get to, blending and all sorts, but all in good time. The very basics of understanding the layers are read from top to bottom, and masks are taken into consideration. And that's the first introduction to masks. So I suggest you press pause now, have a play, get used to toggling these things around on this particular document where it is so blatantly obvious what you can see and can't see. and what masks you want to put on. So I'll put another one on there, for example, and then with black as my foreground colour, just draw a circle in the middle. So it's so blatantly obvious because they are bold, brash shapes in your face. And then once you're happy with that, press play again, and we'll travel on into doing an actual edit in Photoshop. Assuming we're all comfortable now with the very basic concepts of layers and how a mask can influence it, let's go and open up our other document. So back into Lightroom, right click on this picture, edit in Adobe Photoshop. And we're going to start off by adding a layer straight away. This is a special sort of layer called an adjustment layer. All adjustments live under the yin yang sign down here, and we've got some very familiar names, and we'll cover most of these throughout the series, but we're going to start with exposure because it's an intuitive concept to us in the photography world. Here's the exposure tool, and you've got a slider to adjust exposure, offset and gamma. So what are they? Well, exposure targets mostly the highlights and the whites. So if I slide this up, you can see that the highlights and the whites are being lifted long before anything on the silhouette of this chap, albeit you will get little bits of him being impacted. So they are the highlights and whites. The gamma is the mid-tones, so like the middle grey levels. So you can see in comparison to the first slider, we're not actually hitting all those highlights, and guess what's left? Offset. This must then be the shadows and the blacks. And indeed it is. You can see how the silhouette of that guy really closes down very quickly. So that's something we're very familiar with. Notice it came with a mask. All adjustment layers come with masks. Let's add another adjustment layer, shall we? And we'll use the mask. So in this case I want to go for hue and saturation. Again, deliberately picking something that we know from Lightroom and we know from other editing tools. The concept's easy. It came with a mask. The concept is easy. You've got saturation, which we can take all the way down and take all the way up. Whenever I've got sliders, oh, isn't that lovely? Whenever I've got sliders in Photoshop, and Lightroom and new releases, and I always push them right to extremes to get a better understanding in my head of what exactly they do. But more often than not, they are used more subtly. So possibly want to take some of the saturation out behind just a little bit, bring it down. How can I see before and after? I can switch the layer on and off. It's more noticeable in the red and the brick because that's where most of the colour is. You can also adjust the overall brightness with the saturation tool, and you can also change the overall hue or colour. So currently it's at 0, and if I slide it down through, you can see the effect of changing the overall hue of the picture as we go through. And sometimes to find extreme changes, you might find something you like. It might even break some rules in colour grading or break some rules in composition when we're doing other various things, but who cares if it ends up something you actually like. So that's hue. Whenever these sliders have been moved and you want to get them back to where they start, just click on the name here. So I click on hue, it went back to 0. So I'm going to take this down just a little bit more to there. So before hue and saturation, and before exposure, and after. Let's add one more adjustment layer. And I'm going to add brightness and contrast. Again, it's something we're very familiar with. And the brightness and contrast tool, fairly obvious. We have a slider for brightness and a slider for contrast. And I'm quite happy with that. So those three, that was before and that's after. Let's go back to hue and saturation, and I want to desaturate this quite a bit more, but I don't want to desaturate this lovely fresco on the wall behind. So I'm on the mask. If I paint black here, where I paint black, it will stop the effect of the saturation from being seen. So B for my brush tool, and now we're not on silly hard shapes. I'm actually going to go for a soft brush. Make it a little bit bigger with my right hand bracket key. My left hand bracket key makes it a bit smaller. There are other ways to change this, but just for now I'm just going to stick with my bracket key. I've got D for default colors, I've got X so that black's my foreground color, and I'm now just going to paint. I'm on the mask here, you can see I'm now just going to paint around that fresco. Now I went onto the side of the wall there. I didn't really want to do that, so I was a bit too heavy-handed. So what I'm going to do is press X to change my brush to white, and white will reveal what? It will reveal the effect of the hue and saturation, which was to take away the saturation. Make my brush a little bit smaller, and with white I'll just paint down here, there. So overall before and after. So what I did there was I clicked on the first one, held the click and ran down through the layers to switch them all off, clicked it, switched it on and ran it back up. So this is a very first example where we have used adjustment layers and masks to start to edit something in Photoshop. And in this particular case it doesn't matter necessarily which order these went in, these layers, but I chose to use those three layers. So what's this about hard and soft brushes? Alright, well let's go to our background there. B for a brush tool, D for default colors, X to get white as a foreground color, and I'm just going to draw now, because we're on a soft brush, a line. I'm now going to change my brush to a hard brush, and I'm going to click and draw a line. That's the difference. So when we're being subtle and we're blending things in and we're using masks and we want to soften edges, we will have a soft brush. When we want to be very precise and have a bold edge to something we're doing, then we'd have a hard brush. And there are lots of other uses for these, but they are not for now. Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. So there you are. That's the basic concept of layers being read from top to bottom, and of masks and how they influence things by whether they are black or white. There's lots more to learn about layers and masks and such, but we'll build it all piecemeal as we work through the rest of this series, starting with our dive into more of the photographer tool set. In the next video we're going to be looking at removing artifacts, spots, straightening and cropping. We'll also introduce a subject of blending layers. We haven't actually looked at that yet. And then after that, what's to come is retouching, dodging and burning, adding textures, tone curves, gradients, color grading, color matching, color changing. We'll look at photo filters and a whole bunch of other bits and bobs. They all won't be in the very next episode, but they are coming downstream. Next episode will probably major on removing artifacts, spots, straightening, cropping and blending things. So if that's what interests you and you haven't already, click on that subscribe button so you get notified of future episodes as they get released, and I'll see you on the very next one. Don't forget to leave any comments and questions below. Bye for now.